The candlelight quivered in the draught, throwing elongated shadows across the damask wallpaper, its crimson hues filled by age and the soot of 1,000 gas lamps. The parlour, a shrine to excess, was thick with the cloying scent of burning tallow and something damp, earthen, as though the grave itself exhaled. Heavy velvet drapes, the colour of clotted wine, were drawn tightly against the London night, their embroidered tassels swaying ever so slightly in the unseen currents that slithered through the room. Gilded frames, housing stern, oil-painted ancestors, stared down with unblinking disapproval. I sat amongst the gathering of eager-eyed sycophants, ladies and gentlemen resplendent in their evening finery. Crinolines rustled as the women shifted, their corseted waists horsed shallow breaths, while the men, waistcoats brocaded with watch chains glinting, murmured their expectant curiosities. Upon the table's polished mahogany surface, hands joined by the tips of their little fingers, forming a fragile chain between the living and the supposed dead. The crystal decanters of port and sherry stood abandoned on the nearby sideboard, the scent of spiced alcohol cloying in the already acrid air. At the head of this macabre assembly, a medium, Madame Corvina, raised her slender hands, rings glinting like shards of broken moonlight. She was the very picture of mysticism, her high-necked black silk gown pooling about her like spilled ink, a delicate lace at her wrists barely concealing the tremor of theatrical anticipation. Her every movement was slow, deliberate, her posture poised as though she existed in some otherworldly current. The dim candlelight caught the gleam of her hair, streaked grey from jet black, pinned in an elaborate coiffure adorned with jet beads that caught and absorbed the light. With a slight tilt of her head, she exuded an air of knowing, of knowledge glimpsed beyond mortal comprehension. Her eyes, unfocused yet piercing, swept the room as she breathed in the tension that thickened the atmosphere. This night, we welcome the voices beyond the veil, she intoned, her voice the susurration of silk over bone. I did not believe, of course, this was mere parlour theatre, an elaborate farce for the lonely and the weak-minded. And yet, I was there. Perhaps for amusement, perhaps for something more, something I did not care to admit to myself. I told myself I had come at the insistence of Lord Everston, my employer, whose faith in the occult was both laughable and pitiable. We had grown up together, as children who would seek me out whenever he left his manor, eager for companionship outside his gilded cage, and we had become friends. In adulthood, his aristocracy lent him favour in his business ventures, while I, a mere commoner, found myself employed as a warehouse foreman under his patronage. In recent years, however, I had watched his eccentricities grow, his fascination with the arcane tightening its grip. His lineage, old and distinguished, was rife with such peculiarities. I, by contrast, had become pragmatic, hardened by tragedy, embittered by loss. The room hushed. The flames dipped low, supplicating to some unseen force. A draught slithered through the chamber, despite the absence of an open window. A tremor of something I refused to name coiled in my gut. The séance began in earnest. Madame Corvina's voice, lulled and lifted, calling to the dead. The table trembled beneath my fingers, and though I knew it to be trickery, a sleight of foot against wood, my breath tightened in my chest. These charlatans were masters of their art. The air stirred, a candle wavered, its flame guttering as if exhaling the final breath. A chill, unnatural, slithered along the nape of my neck, raising the fine hairs. My breath caught as though the room itself pressed inward, tightening around me. Then, a voice. A whisper, ragged, rusted with sorrow. Jonathan. The room spun. My fingers went cold. That name, my name, trembled in the still air, spoken in tones so familiar I could weep. My wife's voice, Catherine, dead these 5 years, taken from me my fever's cruel hand. My mind revolted against the absurdity of it, against the very notion, yet my heart leapt. I pushed back from the table. A trick, it must be. My pulse hammered as I scanned the room, seeking wires, hidden accomplices, some rational explanation. Madame Calvina only smiled, serene as a cat who had caught a struggling bird between its claws. "Do not flee the truth, Mr. Dainthorpe," she murmured. "She has come for you." Nevertheless, I fled that room in confusion, my mind refusing to accept what my senses had witnessed. I stepped out into the fog-drenched night. The hiss of the gas lamps sounded loud in my ears, their dim halos struggling against the dense air. My boots struck against the damp cobbles, the city looming around me with its soot-streaked facades and the distant clatter of a hansom cab rattling over the stones. Staggering in my confounded state, I made my way to my small abode above the bakery, the scent of warm bread failing to soothe my troubled thoughts. I collapsed onto my narrow cot, staring into the darkness. I did not sleep that night. The house pressed close with a suffocating atmosphere. The gas lamps flickered. The floorboards creaked in the hush of the early hours. A sensation, indefinable yet undeniable, settled upon me. A presence unseen, yet palpable. The next day, Lord Everston arrived at my door, resplendent in his frock coat and top hat, his silver-headed cane tapping me against the threshold. His presence was an imposition, a relic of privilege invading my simple quarters. "You left in a hurry last night, Jonathan," he observed, his tone light but his sharp gaze assessing. "I'm simply checking on your welfare." I nodded, the gesture a hollow supplication. The truth eluded me, skittered just beyond my grasp. "You look white as a sheet," Everston remarked, with an air of patronizing concern. "Take a few days off, paid of course. Return when you are able." I thanked him as he turned to leave. Then he paused, a gloved finger tightening around his cane. "Madame Calvina is conducting another séance at the end of the week. Perhaps it would be wise for you to stay home this time." It was wisdom indeed. I had no desire to be ensnared by that woman's tricks, to be manipulated into parting with what little coin I possessed, merely to hear Catherine's voice once more. Whatever trickery they employed planted the seeds of doubt upon me. Hearing her voice had indeed made me yearn for my lost love. I had not realized how much I depended on her during her brief years with me, and the years following her death had been hard. I had thrown myself into my work, grateful for Lord Everston's patronage, and developed an intolerance of fools and pretenders. The days passed, each one darker than the last. On the first day, as I walked past, a mirror cracked without cause. The next, I swore I heard footsteps sound in the halls when I was alone. On the third, a bang made me jump. As I looked over to my bookshelf, I found that my large leather-bound Bible had fallen onto my floorboards. Picking it up, I turned it over in my hands, wondering about the cause. I had lapsed in my faith following the illness that took my wife. I could not bear to read the words of Scripture. But could my love now be attempting to contact me from beyond the grave? Had Madame Calvina awakened the spirit of my wife, and she was trying to communicate? I could not reconcile these events with my knowledge of the falsity of occult practices, and I shook my head. Perhaps a slight tremor from the bakery below. I could smell the loaves baking. Perhaps their ovens were causing my home to vibrate. That would also explain the cracked mirror and the footsteps. I chided myself again for falling into the mind traps of Madame Calvina, and lifted the Bible to place it back on the shelf. And then I saw it, the journal. It had been hiding where the Bible had sat. I grabbed it and placed it upon my table. It was a relic of Catherine's, its worn leather cover as familiar as the lines of her hand. For a moment I could not move, could not breathe. I had believed it lost with her passing, thrown out in my grief as I sought to rid myself of any reminder of the lost happiness, any recollection of the life we shared. My fingers hovered above it, unwilling to touch, as if by doing so I might unravel the last fragile threads of my disbelief. I recalled her journal keeping. She prided herself on her literacy, a trait unusual for people of our class, and also for her gender. In our society, women of our status were domestics or child-rearers, but her skill with words meant that she had also sought and been given employment with Lord Everston as his personal secretary, a most agreeable arrangement for us. Where I worked in the warehouses, she worked in the offices. She had thought to hide this journal behind the Bible I never read. For what reason? I flipped the cover and began to read. These pages, brittle and yellowed, whispered secrets in ink I did not remember her ever penning. Words of betrayal, of treachery, of murder. My breath caught as I read her final, damning entry. Lord Everston. His name was inked with fury, the lines beneath his name carved deep, as though the pen itself trembled with rage. She detailed how his ledgers worsened with each extravagance. His vices were many, not the least of which was his obsession with death. He desired knowledge from beyond the grave and sought every medium, throwing wealth at them, to try and discover the truth. As his funds dried up, she uncovered his corruption, his theft from the very charities he claimed to champion. But worse still, she had discovered the quiet disappearances, his vices taken to extreme level, the unspoken tragedies among the working-class women whose fates were never questioned, all of whom died from the same illness. A fever took hold and they died of seeming natural causes. The same fever that took Catherine. She had her suspicions of poison, but could not find any proof other from circumstance and hearsay. I wondered why she never confided such information with me. Perhaps she felt worried that we would both lose our livelihoods and end up in the workhouses. Such good employment was hard to come by. I knew of his dark obsession. He had spoken of such things since childhood, but her macabre investigation inferred one clear outcome. Everston had found out that Catherine was aware of his actions and sought to silence her in the same way. I did not wish to believe, but the shadows in my home grew darker. The whispers grew louder. Catherine was here, and she did not rest. Not until I acted. Friday arrived. I returned to Madame Corvina. Lord Everston was surprised to see me, and more surprised that I was cold to his greetings. Another séance, but this time I decided not to be a spectator. I led the invocation, my voice raw, my hands trembling upon the table's surface. The candles sputtered, the air thickened with the scent of decay, a miasma of rot that clung to the back of my throat. The gas lamps lining the walls flickered, their hissing flames casting jagged shadows that writhed like restless spirits. The heavy velvet drapes, once a deep crimson, now appeared black as mourning cloth, their tassels swaying faintly, though no breeze stirred the room. For several minutes, the room was silent and pensive. Perhaps I had been fooled after all. I repeated my spirit calling, my voice cracking under the weight of desperation. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked louder, each second a hammer blow to my resolve. The faint sound of scratching, like fingernails on wood, echoed from beneath the floorboards. Madame Corvina's eyes darted nervously, her usual composure fraying at the edges. Lord Everston shifted in his seat, his polished boots creaking, his gloved hands gripping the edge of the table. And she came. Madame Corvina shuddered, her back arching as her lips parted. From her mouth spilled a thick, luminous ether, swirling and churning as though alive. Ectoplasm coiled in spectral tendrils, pulsing, shifting until it took shape. Catherine's form emerged from the mist, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes pools of darkness. The temperature plummeted, a breath of ice slithering through the room. The candlelight dimmed, suffocated by an unseen force. A pressure built, thick and suffocating, pressing against my ribs, urging my pulse into a panicked staccato. The wallpaper, once a proud floral pattern began to peel, curling inward as if recoiling from her presence. The scent of lilies mingled with the stench of decay, a cruel mockery of life and death intertwined. "Jonathan," she intoned. This time I did not flee. This time I confronted my fear and doubt. Her voice was a whisper, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken grievances. The scratching beneath the floor grew louder, more insistent, as though something was trying to claw its way into the room. The gas lamps flickered wildly, their light now a sickly green hue. The portraits on the walls seemed to shift, their eyes following the unfolding horror. A gust of wind, cold as the grave, a presence that coiled around my chest, pressing, suffocating. Then, her voice, stronger now, pulsing with rage. A ghostly hand rose and pointed to the table, to where he sat. He must pay. The words reverberated, echoing as though spoken from the very depths of a cavern. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. The room erupted in gasps as Catherine's manifestation solidified. The walls groaned, the windows rattled as her form struck terror upon all the witnesses. Even Madame Colvina was taken aback with such a strong, vengeful force from the netherworld. Lord Everston recoiled, his face pallid with fear, his cravat suddenly too tight, his breath coming in shallow gasps. I spoke the truth aloud, my voice shaking but unrelenting. The damning accusations spilled forth, and I produced Catherine's journal and read her words aloud. The ghost of my wife shrieked in triumph and delight as I affirmed his guilt and his damnation. The gathered guests gasped, murmured, shrank away from him. A teacup on the sideboard shattered, its shards skittering across the floor. The growl rose to a deafening roar, and the chandelier above began to sway violently, its crystals clinking like a macabre symphony. Lord Elliston stumbled back, his mouth opening in protest, but something gripped him, something unseen. He convulsed, eyes rolling back as his limbs jerked violently. He screamed, a raw, piercing wail that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the room. The chandelier above swayed, casting wild shadows that danced like spectres on the walls. And then he fell, his body crumpling to the floor with a sickening thud. The growl subsided, replaced by an eerie silence. The gas lamps flickered once more, then returned to their normal glow. The scent of the lilies faded. Catherine, old my Catherine, watched no more. Her revenge fulfilled, she faded, dissolving into the ether. Lord Everston, his face a mask of terror, fled from the house as the guests watched on in bafflement and horror. I remained in my seat, confident in what was to come. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed midnight, its tolling echoing through the empty streets of London. The scratching beneath the floorboards began again, faint but persistent, a reminder that some forces, once unleashed, could not be contained. By morning the rumours spread. Lord Elliston was implicated in the murders of countless women, and as the police arrived at his manor for his arrest, they found justice had already taken place. His body twisted, his face frozen in utter horror. Claw marks marred his throat, as though some unseen force had wrung the line from him. The servants whispered of hearing footsteps in the halls, of doors slamming shut on their own, of a woman's laughter echoing through the empty rooms. The newspapers, printed on yellowing paper, declared it a tragedy, but the illustrations accompanying the articles, crude sketches of a man with bulging eyes and a contorted mouth, hinted at something far darker. Whispers abounded in the fog-shrouded streets, but none dared speak of what he saw. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. And I, Jonathan Dainthorpe, would never doubt again. The gas lamps outside my window flickered, their light dimming as though drained by some unseen presence. I sat in my study, the journal before me, for though Catherine was gone, I knew she awaited just beyond the veil.